The world ended for Lily on a rainy Tuesday. She was coming home from work, the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. The smell of wet leaves and exhaust filled the air. She lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other, so she felt safe walking alone. As she reached her front door, a hand clamped over her mouth. A strong arm wrapped around her waist. There was no sound, just a sudden rush of chemical smell, and then the world went black. She woke up in a room that was completely dark. Her head throbbed, and her wrists and ankles were tied with a thick rope. The gag in her mouth made it hard to breathe. The air was cold and smelled like dirt and old wood. She tried to move, but the ropes held her tight. She could hear nothing but the fast, panicked beat of her own heart. The darkness was so thick it felt like a heavy blanket pressing on her. Time lost all meaning. She didn't know if it had been hours or days. The silence was the worst part. It made her imagine things. Was she alone? Was someone watching her? She tried to call for help, but the gag only let out a muffled sob. Then, a sound. It was faint, a scratching noise coming from one of the walls. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a small, steady sound, like a mouse in the walls. But it wasn't a mouse. It was too slow, too regular. It sounded like a finger dragging slowly across a rough surface. The sound stopped. A new sound began. It was a whisper. It was so quiet she wasn't sure she was really hearing it. But it was there. A low, soft murmur, just at the edge of hearing. The words were a mess of sound, not clear enough to understand. After what felt like forever, a door creaked open. A thin line of light cut through the dark room. A shadow fell across the floor. The person didn't move. They just stood there, a tall, silent shape in the doorway. She held her breath, her body frozen with fear. The shadow moved, slowly, into the room. A hand reached out, and a small, square object was placed on the floor near her. The hand pulled back, and the shadow left. The door closed with a soft click. The darkness returned, but now there was a new smell in the air. The smell of freshly baked bread. She was so hungry. The smell was a kind of torture. She knew she couldn't eat, not with her hands tied and a gag in her mouth. But the person had left something. She began to twist her body, trying to get to the object. After a long, painful struggle, she was able to nudge it with her shoulder. It was a box. A small, wooden box. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. What was in it? She used her chin and shoulder to open the lid. Inside, she felt something hard and smooth. She moved her head, rubbing her cheek against it. It was a small, painted wooden figure. A man with no eyes. This was the first of many strange gifts. Each day, the same routine would happen. The scratch in the walls. The whisper she couldn't understand. The door creaking open. A new object placed near her. A single glass of water left within reach. She learned to drink the water by tilting her head and holding the glass with her chin. The gifts were always odd. A broken pocket watch. A small birdcage with a single, fake flower inside. A children's book with all the words cut out. A single, glass eye. The most chilling part was that they were never random. They felt like a story, a message she couldn't read. Her fear began to change. It was no longer just the fear of being hurt. It was the fear of this person's mind. What did they want? One day, the person left a new gift, a small, sharp knife. Her heart leaped. This was a chance to escape. She spent hours trying to get to it, pushing her body against the ropes. The sharp edge of the knife was a few inches from her bound hands. She could feel the hope burning inside her. She finally managed to get the knife close enough to her hands to start cutting the rope. It was a slow, painful process. The rope was thick, and her hands were weak. But she kept going. The rope started to fray, and then, with a final hard pull, one of her hands came free. She quickly cut the other rope, ripped off the gag, and gulped in the stale air. She grabbed the knife and stood up. Her legs were weak, and she stumbled, but she was free. The room was still dark, but she could now feel her way along the walls. Her fingers found the door handle. It was unlocked. She opened the door and stepped out. The light from another room shone into the hall. She was in a hallway, lined with doors. The air here was even colder. She could hear the sound again. The whisper. It was louder now, coming from behind one of the doors. She crept down the hall, the knife held tight in her hand. The whispers were clearer, but the words were still nonsense. The color of the sky, the whisper of a dead bird, the last dance. She reached the door where the whispers were loudest. She put her ear to the wood. The voice inside was a calm, gentle murmur, like a parent reading a bedtime story. But the words were not for a child. They were the same strange phrases she had heard before. She pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. The light was on. A single, bare bulb. The room was not empty. In the center, a person sat in a chair. It was the kidnapper. He was a man, old and thin, with white hair. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a person sitting across from him. This person was a woman, maybe her own age. She was dressed in a long, white dress. She sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were open, but they were empty. They didn't see anything. On her face, a look of peaceful happiness was painted. Her skin was a dull, waxy color. Lily froze. The man was not talking to the woman. He was talking for her. He was moving her mouth with his fingers, making it look like she was speaking the strange, whispering words. He was putting a new coat of wax on her face with a small brush. Lily looked at the woman's face, a face of pure, serene joy. It was the same look the painted figure from the box had. The man was a sculptor, a collector. He wasn't hurting them. He was making them into art. He was taking away their fear, their sadness, everything that made them human. He was giving them a perfect, frozen happiness. She looked at her free hands, her racing heart, the fear in her throat. She looked at the man and the beautiful, terrifying statue of a woman. A new, deeper kind of horror filled her. He hadn't wanted her to die. He had wanted to make her a masterpiece. And he was very, very good at his work. He was still talking to the statue, not noticing the door was open. "Don't worry," he whispered, moving the woman's painted lips. "Soon, you will have a friend." The world ended for James on a Saturday afternoon. He was 10 years old and a big fan of old comic books. He had spent the entire morning searching for a rare issue in a small, dusty shop on the edge of town. The air was warm and smelled of old paper and rain that had fallen the night before. As he walked home, his treasure safe in his backpack, a van pulled up beside him. A man inside smiled at him, a wide, strange smile. He said, "I have a new toy for you, James." James didn't know how the man knew his name. Before he could think, a heavy hand grabbed him, a cloth was pressed to his face, and everything went black. He woke up with a pounding headache. He was on a cold, stone floor. His hands and feet were tied with thick rope. A cloth was tied tightly over his mouth. He blinked, trying to see, but the room was pitch black. A terrible smell filled the air, like old rust and something sweet and sickly, like spoiled honey. He tried to cry out, but the sound was muffled and weak. He was completely alone. Or so he thought. The first noise he heard was a little click. It came from the corner of the room, a small, tiny sound. Then another click. And another. It sounded like someone was playing with a toy, a small wind-up toy. The sound was friendly, but in the dark, it was terrifying. It wasn't a normal sound for a room like this. It was wrong. James lay still, his heart beating like a drum against his ribs. The clicks went on for a long time, then stopped. Hours passed. He didn't know how many. He felt hungry and thirsty. The rope cut into his skin. He felt a wave of fear so strong it made him shake. He was just a boy, and he was completely helpless. He heard a door open, and a thin line of light cut across the floor. A shadow of a person appeared, a very tall person. They moved slowly, and James could hear a soft shuffling sound as they walked. The person didn't say a word. They just moved across the room and put something down near James's head. The door closed, and the room was dark again. He couldn't see what the person had left. He tried to move his head, to feel it. He finally managed to touch it with his cheek. It felt like a small, smooth doll. He tried to move it with his chin. It was a little wooden soldier, painted red and blue. It had no face, just a blank piece of wood where the eyes and mouth should have been. This was the first of the gifts. Every day, the same thing happened. A light, a shadow, a new gift. Each gift was a toy. A small spinning top. A tiny music box that played a sad, broken tune. A puzzle box with no pieces inside. Each one was perfect and new, but also empty and wrong. The music box played a tune that was off-key. The soldier had no face. The puzzle box was just a hollow shell. James started to understand. The man was not a killer. He was a toy maker. He was a man who loved toys, but not in a normal way. He loved them when they were empty, when they were broken, when they were not what they were supposed to be. The hunger and fear were always there, but the weirdness of the toys started to bother him more. It was a kind of madness he was seeing. He tried to use his hands to break the ropes. His fingers were sore and raw, but he kept trying. One day, the toy maker left something new, a small, silver key. It was placed right next to the ropes that held his hands. It was a test, a game. James knew he had to try. He used his teeth to pull the key closer. He worked at it for what felt like forever, the sharp edges of the key cutting his cheek. Finally, he got a grip on it. With a massive push of his body, he was able to turn the key and get one hand free. He quickly untied the rest of the ropes and tore off the gag. He was free, but he was still in the dark room. He stood up, his legs shaking. The air was so cold. He felt his way along the wall until he found the door handle. It was not locked. He turned it slowly and opened the door. Light flooded into the room. He was in a hallway. It was long and empty, lined with more doors. But the light didn't come from the hallway. It came from the room at the end. He could hear a sound from that room, the same broken music box tune. He ran down the hallway, the wooden floorboards creaking under his bare feet. He stopped at the last door. It was slightly open. He peered inside. The room was like a big workshop. It was full of toys, thousands of them. They were all new, all perfect. On a workbench in the middle of the room, the toy maker sat. He was a thin old man, with glasses on his nose. He was not looking at the toys. He was looking at a boy who was sitting in a chair across from him. James looked closer. The boy was his age, maybe a little older. He was tied to the chair, just like James had been. He was dressed in a suit. His hair was combed, and his hands were folded in his lap. But his face was not a boy's face. It was white and smooth, like a doll's face. His eyes were wide and blue, but they were glass eyes, not real ones. His skin was pale and waxy. He looked like a perfect, empty toy. The toy maker was smiling. He was holding a paintbrush and was painting a little blush on the boy's cheek. James's blood ran cold. The man was not a kidnapper. He was not a killer. He was a toy maker who wanted living boys to turn into his perfect, silent, motionless toys. He was making a collection. And James was meant to be the next one. He looked at the boy in the chair, a perfect toy with no soul. The toy maker reached over and gently wound up the music box next to the boy. The broken, sad tune filled the room. Then the toy maker whispered to the toy boy, "Don't worry, my son. Soon, you will have a brother." He turned his head and looked directly at the door where James was hiding. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked happy, peaceful. He had a new toy to finish. The world for Billy ended on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 9 years old and riding his bike home from a friend's house. The sun was warm on his face, and the sound of his bike tires on the sidewalk was a happy, steady hum. He loved the feeling of the wind in his hair. As he turned onto his street, a white van pulled over next to him. The driver, a kind-looking man with a smile, waved. "Billy?" the man asked. "Your dad sent me. There's a problem at home." Billy, a trusting boy, stopped his bike. He didn't know how the man knew his name. A moment later, a blanket was thrown over his head, and strong arms lifted him into the van. The world went silent and dark. He woke up with a sharp pain in his head. He was lying on a cold, dusty floor. His hands and feet were tied, and a thick cloth was tied over his mouth. The air smelled of old wood and something that was both sweet and chemical, like a strange kind of paint. The room was black, so black he couldn't see his own hands. The only sound was the frantic beating of his heart. He was completely alone. Hours passed. He had no idea if it was day or night. The hunger and thirst started to burn inside him. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach. He tried to wiggle his hands free, but the rope was too tight. He was just a boy, small and helpless. Then, a sound. Not a loud sound, but a soft, scraping noise. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the other side of the room. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. The sound stopped. Then, he heard a new noise. A quiet click. Then another click. It was like someone was building something, piece by piece. The sounds were so slow and careful that they were even more scary than if they had been fast and loud. A thin light appeared. It wasn't a lamp. It was a flashlight, but it was held in a way that made it flicker and jump. The light danced across the room, showing a little bit at a time. Billy saw a wall, cold and gray. He saw a wooden box in the corner. Then, for a second, the light showed him a person. The person was tall and thin. He wore a long white apron, and his head was bent over something on the floor. He didn't look at Billy. The light went out, and the room was dark again. Each day, the same thing happened. The quiet scraping and clicking. The flickering light that showed just a little bit of the room and the person. The person never spoke. He never hurt Billy. He just worked on his project. One day, the person left something new. The flashlight beam stayed on for a moment longer. He saw the person place a small, wooden doll next to him. The doll was a boy, painted to look just like Billy. It had his hair color, his shirt color, but it had no face. Just a smooth, empty piece of wood where the eyes and mouth should be. Billy felt a terror so deep it was cold. The man was not just building something. He was building him. The next day, the man left a small bucket of water and a loaf of bread. Billy, using his chin and shoulder, was able to drink and eat. The man was not a monster who wanted him to die. He was a monster who wanted him to stay healthy. For what? Billy now understood. He was the main part of the man's project. A new gift came a few days later. A small, sharp tool. A carving knife. It was placed right next to the rope on his hands. It was an offer, a twisted game. Billy knew he had to try. 4 hours, he worked the knife against the rope, his hands hurting, his skin raw. He finally cut through the thick rope on one hand. He quickly untied the other hand and tore the cloth from his mouth. He was free. He stood up, his legs weak and shaking. He was still in the dark room. He felt his way to the door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He opened it slowly and stepped into a hallway. The hallway was brightly lit by a single bulb at the end. The air here was colder, and the smell of paint was stronger. He could hear the quiet scrape and click from the room at the end of the hall. The man was still working. Billy crept down the hall, holding the small knife. He reached the open door at the end and looked inside. The room was a workshop. It was filled with white, perfect, empty mannequins. They were all adults, men and women, and they were all smiling. They stood on wooden bases, like statues. The man in the white apron was bent over a mannequin of a boy. Billy looked closer. The mannequin was him. It was a perfect copy of his body, from his hair color to the clothes he had been wearing when he was taken. The man was not a kidnapper. He was an artist, a sculptor of people. He had taken Billy's body and was making a copy. He was making a perfect toy. Billy looked at his own mannequin, his own face, with no eyes. Then he looked at the man. The man was holding a small, sharp tool, the same as the one he had been given. He was carving something into the mannequin's face. The man saw Billy standing in the doorway. He didn't look mad. He looked happy, like a father seeing his son. He held up the mannequin's blank face. "Soon, Billy," the man whispered. "You won't have to be afraid anymore." Billy looked down at his own small hand, which was holding the carving knife. He looked at the man and the empty mannequin. The man hadn't given him a tool to escape. He had given him a tool to finish the work himself. A new kind of horror, colder than the cold room, filled Billy's heart.